This show is sponsored by MidasResources.com, your trusted source for precious metals since 1996. Call Midas today at 1-800-686-2237.
Good Monday morning to you all. Welcome to Uncommon Awareness, today's edition of Uncommon Awareness. If you're new to our program, I'm your host, Dr. Lorraine Hurley, and my site is drhurley.net. I encourage you to visit, sign up for our free newsletter, and there's going to be a couple of other really fun things happening with respect to the radio program shortly. I'm doing something new this week. I have a guest that has so much to share that rather than bring him on now and a month later and a month after that, I've invited him to do an entire week of broadcasting with me. He's got incredible gleanings and understandings, and he's worked really hard throughout his life to understand what is really happening. And he's best known for his YouTube Forbidden History. This is pretty much Desert's how do we say this? His main body of work so far, Forbidden History. But Desert Owl is with us, and he is a bird who sees in the night, a collector of lost sacred writings, a mythologist, a word etymologist, a symbologist, author of the Real Da Vinci Code Etymological Dictionary, the first presenter of the original thought within modern diction, author, translator, historian, researcher, radio host, and you can actually visit his site, The Real Public Radio, therealpublicradio.com. He's a network producer, a student of universal law, a former political activist, and now a spiritual pacifist. And today we're going to go through the anatomy of a political activist. I was very, very involved myself in what we call activist work, still am, but not to the degree that I was. I had to pull back and focus on solutions. We know enough already, and we do need to wake up more people, but we know enough to know that we all have to be 100% personally responsible for what's going on in the world, responsible for educating ourselves, and responsible for getting back our wills and making choices that create the world, the beautiful world we all know is possible. Good morning, Desert.
Good morning, Lorraine. Good to be here. Thank you for having me on Uncommon Awareness. It's really great.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's been, Desert was... Oh, go ahead.
Well, just wanted to correct the website. It was .net, therealpublicradio.net. For anybody
My
who wants
apologies.
to check out my radio museum. Retired now.
Yeah. Well, as you say, you're now working on writing dictionaries and helping people to understand the power of words, the symbolism behind words and letters. And this is very, very powerful work because language, sound is a primordial creative force, and it has an awful lot to do with what's going on at our subconscious level. When we can make it conscious, we can begin to work with these things in a very powerful way. But today you wanted to go through the anatomy of a political activist. And why don't you start by sharing with listeners who you are and, give us a little history. Tell us about Desert.
Right. Well, the first part of my life, actually in my adolescent years, I was having dreams and visions, of something in the future. So I didn't understand them at the time, but I do today, that somehow I was touched by the Great Father of Light, and had to come to terms to learn that and accept it. And apparently it's because things are so bad. It's not that I was qualified for the job of knowing so much or too much, but no matter what, I know the Father is touching people all over the world, and because of the great darkness that prevails. But the stars are those little points of light in the darkness at night, and that's what He does to people. And so I had once I became a young adult, I had about 25 years of study, or thereabouts, of the scriptures, of lost writings, collecting lost writings, and probing all the ancient past. I ended up with 2,000 books on the shelf, homeschooled, home church, all the things, that idealistically a lot of people want to do today because they know that the government wants to run their lives and control their future. Once I ended up giving up construction because it wasn't making the money in Texas once I left California. So ended up going into driving a truck, 18-wheeler, chemical transport, and then I started listening to talk radio. And so after 1 year of being stuck in a truck and listening to talk radio, I concluded certain things, being a researcher myself, that we were in great trouble in our world, and that the political people that were running our world basically were psychopathic murderers and drunk on drinking blood, and waging all the wars throughout all history, that there were really no legitimate wars, as Montesquieu said in the book The Spirit of the Law back in circa 1700s in France. He said that all the wars for the last 2,000 years have been nothing other than to serve as depopulation programs for one another's nation. So he knew something. He must have been an insider to be able to make that statement. And so I call it the Grand Illusion. And I never voted. I never had no interest in the political scene or anything. But when I realized they were coming from my family, I figured I better get involved, because they're going to have to come from me first. And so I became a political activist. Ended up with two organizations. The first one, United Truckers. Well, the first one, was the Council for the National Interest. After I learned about the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, I created the antithesis of the CFR, which lasted until my divorce occurred, and then things broke apart, and I regrouped after my divorce, got a house on a lake up in East Texas, and then I had to get back making money. I went back on the road, and then I created, within that first week of being a slave truck driver, one more time, all over again, a slave, with all the federal regulations that they teach you, and then they tell you how you can lie on every one of the regulations they taught you you're supposed to obey. I created my second organization, United Truckers, Defending the Constitution, and I announced it in Indianapolis on a radio program with Stan Solomon. That day, a lady tipped me off on his program there in Indianapolis at the truck stop. So the rest is history, and and we can continue. I don't want to just keep rolling. I know I'm good at that. And,
that's all right. And you did some interesting things. I mean, when you basically started radio, you were doing radio as a trucker. You were telling me that you would pull off into a restaurant and get yourself a little booth, and you just you decided to use radio yourself to begin to open up the dialogue, the conversation with other people about what was going on.
Absolutely. Well, what happened, again, the grace of the Heavenly Father, always, when I got into the movement, and I was totally introverted, I couldn't even talk in a crowd, but, I really was a shell. And so I had to come out of the shell, and and it was because I knew the truth. And so that caused me, to then finally get on radio. I was being offered interviews with my first organization, and then the second organization with United Truckers, I was doing interviews based on my organization, and then one day I did an interview with Jeff Baker out of Tampa, Florida, Amerinet Broadcasting, and then after the interview, Jeff called me back and offered me a program on Sundays, and I said that'd be great, and so I called it America's Driving Force, and so that was a 1-hour Sunday program beamed up on Galaxy satellite and downloaded to AM and FM radio and shortwave around the world, and so I would do my Sunday broadcast while I was driving all over America in my 18-wheeler. I was doing my survey. I was trying to confirm a lot of the things I've been hearing. I was interviewing people like Charles Collins, who ran for president. I took him out to barbecue on his 5-mile estate, 5-mile wide estate, and and got to meet outstanding people. I hung out with the friends at Right Way Law back there in Canton, Ohio, back in the 1998 period, 1997, and so went from coast to coast and just learn stuff. I was learning, and I made major discoveries, like the fact that, how they teared up all the railroad ties all over. And no one's ever talked about this one before, so I might want to get it on record now, since you've got me on a big network to share this type of knowledge. But I had remember hearing on Chuck Harder's radio broadcast. He was my big inspiration, For the People, Chuck Harder. The guy's unbelievable, and they stole his network from him, so that's why we don't hear from him today. But he was talking about on his program how they were tearing up railroad ties, throughout America in the back wooded areas where they would have, factories and warehouses. And so, when I went to a couple trucking facilities, like around Louisville, Kentucky, and then up in upstate New York, I went into facilities that were now trucking facilities that were clearly, prior to this being a trucking facility, were rail facilities. The rail freight cars would pull in, they'd unload the freight cars, and then they would, distribute by truck to the rest of the region. And so I went into other backwooded areas driving my truck, and I found out that they had pulled up the rails and the ties, and they paved over the road. You can see where they paved over the railroad track right across the road when you drove across the road, and that they cinder blocked these warehouse doors. Now, you have to ask yourself a logical question. If you owned a railroad, what would be your incentive to want to tear up your own railway and to deny yourself the ability to do commerce? It's not logical, and it only fits one agenda, and that is if you're trying to float an economy and to make it look prosperous, you see. And so I finally concluded that what I had learned and heard on radio with For the People, Chuck Harder, God bless him, was absolutely true, that they had literally pulled up rails all over America, and they took out of circulation approximately 100,000 rail cars. And so what happens when you do that and you got to haul freight? Well, then it means you have to go to trucks, and that means one truck, one rail car is equivalent to about 5 trucks, okay, because of the size of a rail. So literally, if you took 100,000 rail cars off of circulation, hauling freight, you could put 500,000 trucks on the road and about 750,000 drivers in work. Okay, so what they were doing, they had to float the economy. So this is the Illuminati, okay, because they're trying to float our economy, a paper tiger, and to keep it floating as long as they can. They want the economy to look good. And the other way they float the economy is that they keep making more statutory code rules and regulations so that people keep going to prison for they don't even know why and what they did wrong, so that they don't have people all in the streets homeless. Because if you took the 2 or 3 million people that don't belong in prison today and put them back home, they won't have a job and they'll be on the street homeless with a tin can in their hand. You see, so this is the greatest show on earth, and it's a money racket, and nobody knows how the game is played. But the Father has showed me through this adventure I've been on of learning.
We have done shows, Desert, that do discuss the privatization of prisons.
Truth is stranger than fiction. What can I say?
Right. No, this is resonating because we have more people in prison in the United States per capita than any other nation in the world. Yeah, I'm here. Am I not being heard?
I hear you now. Are you there?
Okay, all right. Well, we're going to break. I'll repeat my comments when we come back after this break, listeners. Again, we're here with Desert Owl, TheRealPublicRadio.net. You can begin to glean some of his own education and research, and we'll see you in just a few moments. We're back, and just before the break, I want to check in. Desert, can you hear me okay?
I hear you loud and clear. Love that music.
Okay, good. Yeah.
On,
I'm tired of it. And actually, Shane, he works for the pre-production staff at GCN. It turns out to be a musician. He writes these little ditties and so forth. So he's creating some new bumper music for me because while Glenn Miller's "I'm in the Mood" is wonderful, after a while it begins to wear on you. It wears on me.
My theme song
it is very happy and upbeat.
Starry Night. It's got a different flavor though.
But before the break, you brought up I hadn't heard that. I didn't know about the railroads being pulled up for the purpose. But most of the listeners to this program are incredibly astute and intelligent. Based on their communications with me, I can tell you that they're a very above average in terms of what they're interested in learning about. And we do know that the economy, this is one of the big battles we have, is to educate people about the nature of the Federal Reserve note, this fiat currency. It's a debt-based economy. And what's happened just with inflation, over and over again, people are the economy. What they don't realize is that things are simply being manipulated and floated because we're not dealing in assets. We're not dealing, I forget what percentage of medical expenses, what percentage of the gross domestic product, but America is no longer a country that is producing goods and services throughout the world, we've become insular in what we're doing, and our present sick care system requires spends huge amounts of dollars on care that doesn't actually equate to health care. It's sick care. So we're pretty aware of that. But what I find very curious, so with the economy, what's happening now today is you've got two people in a family that must work. You have what they call latchkey kids. The economy, money itself, that term, money is the root of all evil. As in my own research, I'm beginning to comprehend just how true that is. We all think we have to have money when in fact there was a time in human history when we simply bartered, when people produced according to their gifts or their abilities or their opportunities and exchanged with one another. And now we have, if anyone doubts that the Federal Reserve manipulates, depressions and collapses and so forth, doesn't believe that they do that, they need to think again, because this is really all intended to move us towards a grand scheme of one global power, of globalization. And I don't know if that's necessarily your particular take on things, Desert, but it seems to me that money, we have to all give a lot of thought to what exactly money is. And there are movements throughout the world right now to restore what Charles Eisenstein calls sacred economy, sacred economics, learning to form a community in which you become mutually dependent and productive for one another. So now you have firsthand knowledge of the fact that this is true. They've ripped up the rails. They've put all these trucks on the road. They've put all these people on the road. Where do you want to go from here? What happened next that was particularly...
Well, I want to footnote, two things you talked about. Number one, people think that the nation is being orchestrated through Washington, but it's not. It's been orchestrated through think tanks like Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and they created a state of interdependence. That's why back in the 1980s, all of the machinist trades went over to China. That's why literally the Chinese dismantled smelting factories and other type of factories here in America, took the entire factory over to China and rebuilt it. Go figure. They tear down our buildings and they reconstruct them in China. Remember throughout the 1970s and 80s and 90s, they called China the most favored nation while they're harvesting organs from prisoners in their prison cells and doing all the, the mayhem, Tiananmen Square, running people over with tanks, machine gunning them. So that's the most favorite nation of the Nazi state. So the think tanks are pulling the strings for the Federal Reserve System. They're the real government. And in fact, if you look in the back of the Encyclopedia Britannica, not Americana, but Britannica, that dominates America as a book, it says right in there that all of the policies and influences that go on within the United States government is first conceived of within the Council on Foreign Relations. So it admits right there. In fact, even Leslie Gell in his annual report in the their book, which is a newsletter, a book.
Yeah, hold those thoughts
right
because we're going to hold those thoughts. Desert. We're going to break. The music indicates a break, so we're going to break. And I'm just going to let you pick up. Where you left, where we're leaving off right now. He's talking about, this is it, listeners. It's really right in our faces. They're not hiding what they're doing.
For the love of clean water.
Okay, listeners. We're back. And I just want to make a comment. Desert before the last break was talking about a shadow or global government. And I'll tell you when I came to the realization that this was in fact, again, this is, I'm not an expert, but it makes sense to me. I got my start in activism with geoengineering, wanting to understand what was going on, what were they really doing, what was happening here. And when I began to comprehend this was a global program, something has to be going on globally. The idea that, it's simply a technology that different countries are competing to master, for the advantage, their own particular national advantage, just doesn't fly when you really look into it. Something is permitting things to take place on a scale globally that without it's crimes against humanity, without our consent, without our permission. There is a cadre, there is a mafia, if you will, whatever you want to call it. People call it the Illuminati, the elite. I don't like to use those words with them because I don't choose to honor them with words that basically suggest that they are any better or higher or above us. This is, and I've said it many, many times, this is the result, what we're seeing happening in today's world is the result of a small group of psychopaths, and whether we call them cyborgs or archons or, to me, they're just plain sick. They're not human. At least they've lost the human capacity for compassion, love, and the things that make relationships sweet, the things that make life sweet. They don't possess these attributes. So you were talking, I want you to continue where you left off. I just wanted to make that comment that for me, being an activist in geoengineering, this is when I really had to begin to consider that there was a global or a shadow governing body over the entire world.
Well, that's the way it's always been, basically. There's my books are packed away, so I can't just quickly look at the spine in reference to it. But basically, prior to the flood, the great flood of Noah, there was a one world order. Okay, so this thing about the New World Order, there has always been a one world order. You can call it the old world order. I call it a one world order. And periodically, different cultures, and because it is a shell game, and even the rulers of each governmental nation or kingdom doesn't know how the game is played. He only knows that he better do what he's told, or he'll be marched upon and taken down. So he'll play his role and do what he's told to do. Before the flood, it was global, and it was at the time of Egypt when the pyramids were being built, and that's why pyramids were being built all over the world, because it was this, and in fact, you can find the parallel in the words. This is what we'll talk about later on in the week, so I don't want to go into the history right now, but I'm pointing out the fact that this agenda, in other words, how can they be so good? They want us to be diverted, and thinking that it's the Bilderbergs, a bunch of corporate CEOs trying to take over the world, when in fact it's all controlled through religion, and politics is secondary, and then of course they control education. Money, of course, is the key control, because without commerce, nothing moves. And then, of course, the words, and they do that outside the Vatican at the College of Abbreviators, where the Jesuits, Curii, control the words. So the Grand Illusion is buying into all of the lies and brainwashing that they fed us from the day when we started watching cartoons on television. And then they wanted to get us into nursery schools, even predating, before we get into kindergarten. There was a book that was discovered in an IBM typewriter come from out of the government in a resale, and it was called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. And in there, it referred to making the economy in such a way that ultimately mom and dad would both have to work, and they called the children in the book, then we would have occupationally orphaned children. So they got the children occupationally orphaned because mom and dad both have to work, and now they can even begin priming them right in preschool, even before kindergarten. I mean, at the most impressionable ages, when they are the biggest absorbers of knowledge and information, at age 1, 2, 3, and 4, they want control of their minds so that they can be, and you look at the computer games, all the boys today on computer games playing war games, it's sick, they're primed to kill. Okay, that's why we have all of these easily controlled, mind-controlled, cyborgs out there that are ready to pull a trigger, on anybody. The day that the Columbine school shooting occurred, I was actually facing the trial of my life, okay? And I was actually, okay, I'll just say I was in a mental hospital for 40 days. I was captured and I was visiting. They were trying to determine if they could have a trial with me or declare me mentally incompetent. And so it was like a vacation compared to the torture I was being put through in the regional jail in West Virginia. I've got the record for the longest case in West Virginia's history. It's another story I don't want to get into, but bottom line was when I was in this mental hospital, I made a friend in there, and he was a Jew, and he had been going around the country. He was there in that mental hospital because he had a bunch of long rifles in the back of his pickup truck in the camper shell. The police saw it, looked through the window, and they arrested him, confiscated all the weaponry. When we're sitting in the mental hospital watching television, and it's like a Motel 6. I mean, state of the art, all you can eat, gourmet food. I loved it. What a vacation compared to the cinder block cell I was living in. While they were trying to try me, so when we're watching Columbine and the shooting that occurred, when these children are running out of school and this terrible event had occurred, then all of a sudden this guy that's sitting next to me goes, "You see that? You see that? That's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do." And I said, "You mean you're going to do that?" And he said, "Yeah. And that's what I'm going to do." And I said, "Well, good. I don't ever want to talk to you again. Okay, get away from me." And so, see, there was a guy who had been going around the country, and he's under the control of the rabbi. You see, he's mind control. He's good to go. Whenever they need him, they can use him for their own effect. So there's not just, these small events going on. There's literally hundreds of good-to-go, mind-controlled, brainwashed stooges, what do you want to call them, pawns, in this bigger grand illusion. They got us watching violent television. It just seems natural. And when was it natural to watch people being slaughtered and bleeding to death? Never was that supposed to be natural. I rescued my sweetheart, that 16-year-old sweetheart, when I was 18. Her brother-in-law was systematically raping her, and within a 36-hour period, I got shot. I got stabbed 5 times and shot with a 30-30 rifle after the bullet went through my friend, and I couldn't watch violent television for the next year. Okay, the psychology of violence nobody understands until it happens to them, and they'll never want to watch violent television again.
Right. Now, you just said a couple of interesting things. I just want to point out with Columbine, there was a lot going on with that where there was first thing I thought was those kids had to be on psychotropic drugs because this is what they're doing with our youth are very, very sensitive. And as they begin to go off and behave in ways that are not socially, quote, acceptable, in whatever capacity, they're usually taken to the doctor and put on drugs. And these drugs we know cause homicidal and suicidal tendencies. The percentages that they're willing to acknowledge are far, far and away less than what is actually going on. But the other thing these drugs do, if they don't create homicidality or suicidality, is they numb. They limit the range of emotional experience. And so a lot of people have said to me, I have one friend who says, "I will never, ever give up my Paxil. She feels it saved her life." But I have noticed that her ability to exhibit a range of emotion is stunted. So there's this one, basically this safe zone of emotional experience or expression. And to her, that is preferable to the anxiety and the other experiences she was having before going on the drugs. But I think the experiences themselves are an indication that because children are sensitive, what's happening to our children is showing us how the world is coming apart, and because it isn't conducive to a natural state of being. It's completely counter to a natural state of being.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk. Again, understanding the metaphors and the terminologies that they use. You see, they use this term third world, right? And we always think of Central America, South America, the poverty, but it's a metaphor. You see, because the third world is the matrix. It is the world that they have created. Obviously, they also created the poverty and the devastation anywhere you look. It's their creation, okay? So that is the third world. It's the illusory world that they control and that they manipulate and that they got everybody to think that they are really in. when there is another reality, okay? And that's the reality that they don't know exists. It's separate from the falsehood, from the lies and the deceit and the false opinions. Everybody has an opinion, and you know where they got their opinion from? Their strong conclusion about things from somebody else. They've never learned how to figure anything out on their own. They don't know how to reason. They don't know how to process. They don't know how to think because they've been instructed and told what to think.
Right. And that's what school has become. It's not about how to think, it's about what to think. And I did have, again, another friend share with me just the other day, we were having a conversation. There was an article in a newspaper, she said. Basically, it was out of Harvard, and it talked about what was going on in the elite schools, right, the Ivy League schools, and how at one time people were recruited and you got into those schools because it was believed that you had some ability, some capacity for thinking and contributing to the world. And now it's all gotten down to basically economics, how this, a degree from this particular school will provide you with a lifetime of economic security. So I don't have time I don't have the article in front of me. I don't have time to go through it. But this is
we can call it a degree of another brainwashing, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they have completely overtaken it. They've got this new Common Core curriculum, which my daughter is 16 and a half, and I shared this with listeners. She, the last year or so, last January and February, she homeschooled. She was brought up homeschooled through elementary years, and she was so fed up with school. She even asked me, because I've shared, I dropped out of high school, and then I went back later and got a college degree and a medical degree, and then found my sanity again. But, she said, well, why can't I just do what you did? I said, that's not an option, but we can think about, creating an education curriculum for you that will actually interest you. I'll share a little bit more about that story when we come back, listeners. We're taking our last break of the first hour. Desert will be with us all week long. Today our topic is the anatomy of a political activist, and I think I'll try to regroup us back that way. Moving along, we're going to be wrapping up in a few moments, and Desert will be with us in the second hour, but our topic today was anatomy of a political activist. And listeners, there is an agenda, a hidden agenda to turn the world into a kingdom that serves the whims and control of the few at the expense and enslavement of the many. And this has taken me years to come to the realization that this is not conspiracy. I'm not mentally unstable. This is really the way I see the world, and I still have more to learn. And I try to bring people on the program from all walks of life, people that are really having, last couple of weeks we did we share with you some astonishing success that certain organizations are having in holding back this march towards total global enslavement. And that was the National Liberty Alliance managed to reinstate the first in 80 years, first ever common law grand jury, because a common law grand jury is able to indict the lawyers and the judges and the politicians and so forth that are wreaking havoc on the world. And what passes for freedom today in political terms is still a shell of what true human freedom is all about. And this is where we're indoctrinated, we're brainwashed into looking at things comparatively. Okay, so we don't have a communist government. We think we could say and do what we want in America with relative freedom compared to the rest of the world, where nothing could be further from the truth. As soon as you start to get onto the truth of things, you will be labeled mentally unstable, a conspiracy theorist, or thrown in jail, have all sorts of trumped-up charges against you. And this is why we need to realize that we're at a point in human history where we have to make a decision. We either wake up and decide that we do indeed have power through just through our innate human abilities, this thing called consciousness. Consciousness actually does create reality, and they're throwing so much fear and so much, as Desert was saying, blood and killing and lying. It's everywhere, and we've become desensitized. And when we permit ourselves to actually take up, to own sensitivity to what's really happening, we're going to be unstoppable. But it's going to take a lot more than what currently than what we currently have to come to this reality, to come to the realization that something wicked this way comes, as Ray Bradbury would say. So, Desert, you were just talking about meeting with this man in you're locked up. They were trying to determine whether or not you were mentally competent to stand trial. Really what they were trying to do is figure out would they be better off with you in jail or locked up in a mental hospital. They certainly wouldn't want you on the street, right?
Sir, ma'am? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I said they certainly didn't want you on the street.
Well, it wasn't. I just want to comment real quick on your freedom thing, because there is no freedom. Okay, there is free range, and they taught the slaves how to take care of themselves. The best slaves are happy slaves that will go to work from Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and do their work. They've harnessed our labor, is what they've done. You see, and so what and the labor is what backs the money, the funny money, the commerce. It's all backed on labor through the birth certificate. Of course, I know you know that, and probably your listeners do too. But when I was through with political activism, after the MI6 and local flunkies, pieces of garbage basically that pretended to be Christian patriots, surrounded me and cost me my house on the lake with a dock, and after a divorce and losing everything, and I lose that, and I'm staying with my treasurer and at his house, and then they basically Shanghai everything from me, and so after I've lost everything, I went to West Virginia to stay with my radio sponsor, and little did I know that she was already in the middle of a government sting operation. So I moved in there, and it started with the feds, and there was two. You see, West Virginia is a mind control state, classically. Just read the book "Transformation of America" by Kathy O'Brien and Mark Phillips, and you'll learn about that. I see we're going to the top here, so I'll just try to cap it.
We're going to the top. We're back at 6 past. All right, so why don't we just pick up? Gotcha. Yeah, we'll just pick up with the rest of the story when we come back at 6 past the hour. Listeners, during the break, go to therealpublicradio.net. And we did a little segment last week on self-ownership. I just encourage you to peruse the site and to listen to some of the information. He's a master at weaving, at synthesis, at pulling many, many things into one whole. And we're going to go on to that later on this week.